And we're live. Welcome to Spec Women Chat, episode 1. Diane Morrison, and I'm very pleased to have some really exceptional ladies here in the room today. I'm very sorry about my picture. It's probably going to look like that the whole podcast, but that's fine. It's not me you have to hear from. So in no particular order, I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly. Let's see here, notes to come up. Currently the president of the SFWA. Her name is Kat Rambo. She's been shortlisted for a whole whack of awards that are respected in the genre, including the Hugo and the Locus and a bunch of others. And we've her names up. Kat showed us how to do that, so thank you for joining us. Here, okay. The creator of the chat hashtag, who writes under the pen name occasionally Karis Waters. She is a writing coach, empowering women in speculative, and writes under the pen world traveler and an independent author. Of Nancy Jane Moore. She's the author of the science fiction novel The Weave, Changeling, and Ardent Forest. Her fiction has appeared in a number of anthologies. She's studied martial arts since 1979, degree black belt in Aikido, so a real life butt kicker. Cool. Hoping that Laura J. Mixon will be joining us. She hasn't is a chemical and environmental engineer, better known as a science fiction writer. She writes about the impact of technology and environmental changes on personal identity and social structures, and her work has been the focus of academic studies on the intersection of technology, feminism, and gender. I'm really hoping to hear from her today. Under the name Morgan J. Locke, she was one of the writers for the group blog Eat Our Brains, which was the Hugo Award winner for Best Fan Writer in 2020. So welcome, ladies. I'm so glad you could join us today.
Well, thank you so much for the invite.
Thanks for the invite, Diane. This is awesome.
Yes, we're very glad to be here.
Okay, so I figured that we would start with Katie, since she is here for about half an hour and then she has to go. Created the Spec Women Chat on Twitter. I wanted to ask her about why she created the hashtag and what she was hoping that
Sorry, you kind of cut out in the middle. Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, sorry about that. Of the hashtag Spec Women Chat on Twitter, and I consulted with her before for the use of the podcast title, and I would like to know why you created the hashtag that women fiction might get out of it.
Yeah, so thanks so much for inviting me to come join. I'm thrilled to be here. I love speculative fiction, and particularly empowering women who write speculative fiction in many different genres. As she mentioned, I'm a writing coach, and I also write and edit, professionally edit speculative fiction, and particularly specialize in working with women authors. So part of the reason why I created the Spec Women Chat hashtag, it actually came out of just my desire to connect with other women writing speculative fiction on Twitter, because I connected with a few, but just hadn't really managed to make a lot of connections. And so I actually posted to some of my different connections I already had, saying, you know, this is the kind of person that I would love to connect with. I'd love to connect with women who are writing speculative fiction and just be a part of that community. And so I asked for recommendations for people to follow and had an overwhelming, wonderful response from the fabulous Twitter writing community. And there were so many women that responded to me saying, I would love to connect with other women writing spec fiction, but I don't know them, or I don't know how to connect. And so that's really how the Spec Women Chat hashtag was born, as it were. I replied to that original post that everyone had been saying, follow this person, or I'd love to get to know people, or whatever. And so I really just used it as a way to facilitate these conversations and kind of bring it all together in one place, so that women writing speculative fiction who wanted to connect with other women who are kind of facing the same challenges could do that kind of in an organized way.
That's fantastic, because I've been getting a lot out of that myself. I don't know how long the hashtag had been running when I caught onto it finally, but there's a huge community of writers out there on Twitter, and Twitter might be a cesspool, but writer Twitter is awesome. It's very supportive, and I find it very helpful myself to discuss things about the issues that face us in particular, the writing process, our particular brand of crazy. For doing that, I've really been enjoying it.
Yeah, it was quite funny actually, because for the longest time, like, I had just avoided Twitter because I was super intimidated by it and couldn't quite figure out how it worked. And then finally last year I was like, okay, I'm going to figure this out, right? And so slowly started doing that and asking questions, and found some of the writer hashtags, like the hashtag on the porch. They were fabulous, just being very welcoming. And so I was quite surprised actually to discover what a vibrant community there is for writers on Twitter. Um, but I saw a bit of a lack, if you will, of a way to connect with other women writing spec fiction, since it seemed like most of them were writing contemporary romance or historical fiction, or some of those genres, which I do enjoy, but are not really the ones that I wanted to focus on and particularly connect with. So, yeah.
Fair enough. I've learned that there is an amazing number of women doing various genre fiction out there. If you've been wondering what happened to, say, all those little romances that used to exist, Silhouette and whatever, they all went independent, and they're all writing, and it's out there. I'm not a romance writer myself. Speculative fiction's always been my thing too, so I find this really cool recently, but still a speculative fiction romance. So then after that, we got into this wonderful Twitter conversation. It was just the coolest thing, and it started that with Tar on the tor.com website, and I will provide the link in the show notes and video description below when everything is said and done. From Dark to Dark, yes, women have always written space opera. Just read like the first paragraph or so that of what we're talking about. And Kat reposted this recently, and I'd already shared it to my blog, so then we got into a discussion about that and recommendations of women out there who write. So she writes, every year or two, article about a genre that women have just now entered, which used to be the province of male writers. Form of science fiction. Lately it's been fantasy, especially epic fantasy, which strikes me with fierce irony because I remember when fantasy was pink and squishy and comfy and for girls. Theme space opera gets its regular turn in the barrel. He's written space opera. Ever heard of Lee Brackett? Andre Norton, surely. Remember them. And X chromosome carries magical powers of invisibility. Don't get the reviews. Just critical attention. Just as not important. Erased. So that that's where the conversation started. I would love to hear take ladies on, and if any of you have had experiences where you feel in the industry and about it, if anything, just to take the question, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because I also am the managing editor for an indie publisher across our press. And so it's interesting going to conferences because we publish speculative fiction, but we also publish several other genres as well. And one of the interesting comments is people get quite excited about it, and a lot of women get very excited about it. But I mean, there's so many times when I also get this question of, and they ask, the stand-in question at a writing conference is, what do you write? And I write, well, I write steampunk and urban fantasy, and I just finished editing a space opera trilogy, and all this kind of thing. And then they start looking at you very strangely, and they're like, you don't really look like the type of person who would write sci-fi, which I always find rather humorous. But which, okay, fair enough. There's a stereotype for a reason, but that doesn't mean that everyone who writes sci-fi fits the stereotype. But I mean, I think that there have always been women writers in science fiction, space opera, various types and genres. I think that because of the digital age, we have more opportunity to be more visible now, which I think is to our advantage, but also has maybe started raising these questions a little bit more because it is more visible, and so people are like, oh, this is a thing now, when actually it's been a thing. It's just a difference in the ability to be more visible, if that makes sense. But I mean, there is still, I think, I don't want to say a stigma per se, but there's a preconception of what women write and what type of person writes science fiction or fantasy or really any kind of speculative genre. I mean, I think maybe less so with some of like the urban fantasy, paranormal romance, some of those kind of things. It's not as surprising because of even dystopian, because of the popularity of some of those female writers. But specifically in like the science fiction, space opera, um, higher fantasy, those kind of things, there does kind of tend to be that preconception, I think.
Well, one of the things for me has been that I very much wanted to write stories with women lead characters, women having the adventures, and for me that made space opera an ideal world to work in, because I got to, you could work I could conceive of a future in which nobody asked why that woman got to be a warrior. She just got to be a warrior. So it really never occurred to me this was supposed to be a male genre. And in the end, when with my novel, I've published short fiction in a lot of different genres, but my novel came out from Aqueduct Press, which is a feminist press, because they recognize the idea of having a story with a female main character, and that's and the woman having the adventures. And to me, that's one of the key things. It's not just women authors, but it's women authors writing about real women doing. Space opera can be some of the things that space opera can be actually fairly real in terms of the way people interact. Obviously, we're making up a whole lot of other things in it. But to me, it's a perfect genre for writing feminist adventure stories, and that's why I ended up with not only that, but that's a lot of it.
This is a topic that has been very near and dear to my heart since back in college days, when I hit a book by, in fact, one of the authors that we should be celebrating, Joanna Russ, called How to Suppress Women's Writing. And I heartily recommend this because I think to talk about kind of how women get erased, this is in fact a sort of handbook on sort of all the different ways it happens. Them get enacted over and over again. And I think one of the things that we have to do is to keep on passing word of the important names. And you asked about kind of moments where this hits one in the industry. And I'm thinking about a few years back, I went down to a convention that I shall not name. And I was on a panel about cyberpunk. And I was on it with two other folks, neither of whom were actual writers, but one of whom had done some critical writing about cyberpunk. And these two folks literally did not let me talk. And as a writer, I am using the word literally correctly, as in every time I tried to speak, they spoke over me. And one of them was just perfectly oblivious to it. And the other one, about 5 minutes before the panel ended, turned to me and kind of laughed nervously and said, "Ha, I guess we didn't let you talk at all, did we?" And I said, "No, you didn't," because I was pissed, right? But I was polite about it. And afterwards, every single woman in the audience came up to me and was just like, "Oh my God," you know, and now I kind of wish I had made more of a fuss about it. But it's hard when you are trained to be polite and when in fact you are a junior writer and you don't want to be the person who's coming across as bitchy or strident or any of the other gendered terms that get applied to women. But I was the only person on that panel that actually had written about cyberpunk, not just writing fiction, but also I had written 3 papers in graduate school on cyberpunk, you know, and I was prepared to mention names like Pat Cadigan and Elizabeth Hand and Rebecca Orr, you know, just people who were working in the genre. And I think that's important, is to not let our voices get silenced. And I, you know, again, I would do it differently if I were doing it again, but also to keep celebrating women. And so that was why I created the Twitter handle, because I was just like, well, how many of us are there? And can I do a Twitter list where I can go and look at it and be like, okay, what are the women in fantasy and science fiction? Not just the writers, but the editors and the publishers, because editors have a very strong tradition in fantasy and science fiction. How do we keep their names alive? Well, this is one way. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point as well, because and that's why I love what you're doing here, Diane, because I think such an important part of it is just having that visibility factor that comes from supporting each other and from, you know, have you read this author? She's a fabulous, you know, one of the books that I just finished, we just finished doing the trilogy. I was the editor on all 3 of them. It's a female author. Her name is A.C. Williams, and she wrote a space opera trilogy called the Destiny Trilogy. And it was really interesting talking to her, because I've gone to several conferences with her and stuff. And you know, and again, so many people would say, you know, "Oh, what do you write?" You know, and she wrote a romantic comedy, and so like, "Oh yeah, okay," you know, they expect that. She's a very funny person, and she's like, "Oh, and then I also wrote this epic space opera trilogy, and you know, I'm working on the follow-up trilogy," and they just kind of look at her like, is this collective gasp, right? But I love when we can talk and share about each other's stories, because I think part of the issue that we run into is not so much that people are not they're not so much resistant to the idea as they're just not aware that such a thing exists. At least that's been my experience. It's like, you know, did you know that, you know, they're like, "Oh yeah, I'd love to read some fantasy, you know, other than kind of the big names, well-known ones, by an indie author who's, you know, a woman." And I was like, okay, well, here, I can give you this long list of names of clients that I've worked with or books that I've read, you know, and kind of go from there, and just talking about it in that sense as well, I think is beneficial. Kind of another thought somewhat related to this as well is just really continually seeking to improve our craft. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm huge on craft, and story and character depth. And because I think there's a place to speak up and to say, you know, you need to pay attention to this and not ignore this. But I also think that if there is a preconceived idea that, you know, women can't write space opera as well as men or whatever, I've personally found that there's more value in saying, giving a book to someone and then coming back to you and saying, wow, this was a spectacular series and the world building was fantastic and all of that. And then you say, oh, yes, you know, my friend Amy wrote it and she's fabulous, right? Because then it's like you've allowed the fiction to overcome any barriers that there might be and to be able to then create that shift in perception, if that makes sense. And then they can kind of realize that for themselves. It's like, oh, okay, there actually was a misconception there.
There's so much in what you ladies have said so far that I'd love to address. There's like this conversation and all that. Okay, I'll start with my own big marginalized experience, right? Okay, aside from the fact that I was always the one girl in the group full of guys playing dungeon and all of that sort of thing, right? I sat down for my first ever National Novel Writing Month and I said, I'm writing a fantasy space opera. One of the people in my group, a gentleman, said, I'm glad you're writing fantasy. Women can't write science fiction. And I was like, okay, Lois McMaster Bujold, you know, and on, right? But I've had that experience being interrupted. Women are, I think, something like 5 times more likely to be interrupted than men are when we are speaking. Trying not to allow this to happen to me anymore. This is a conscious decision I've made. I'm interruptee and saying, excuse me, I was talking in my best mom voice. And often that works. So I don't know. I'm trying it. We'll see how it goes. It seems to be working at home. Women in stories, women in adventure stories. I remember as 8, I think, when I first picked up The Hero and the Crown. And enamored. I was like, yes, this is what I want to be like. This is me if it were a story. You know, I was like, you know, because I was always the kid that, you know, spoke up, couldn't keep my mouth shut, you know, and I thought, yeah, okay, where she was coming from. And I was so delighted that there was this action hero who was a girl. It's much more common nowadays, I think. And we have this industry of young adult science fiction, and dystopia in particular has taken off, and we're there. You know, and this wasn't that long ago. I'm only 40 something, right? So in the 80s, you had your fiction and you had your adult fiction, and that was your option, right? So I quickly graduated into McCaffrey and all these other great talented women because of kids literature. Okay, so there's that. And also talking about not being heard, not being seen. A bunch of studies recently, and I will try to find some of those links and put them in the description. Here's what it comes down to. As far as these studies can tell, give a damn the author of a book is here. But the industry thinks that they do. Much more likely to market anything written by a woman with the pink and glitter treatment, as I like to call it, and they don't take it seriously. They don't give it as many reviews. Women, especially if they're going to write adventure fiction, to write using their initials. It's less likely that they will be. Andre Norton legally changed her name. Now, this is back when, of course. And James Tiptree Jr., of course, is the pen name of, get her last name, Alice but it was
Alice
her
Sheldon.
pen name, right? Yes. Right? Who, because they wouldn't have taken them seriously in the genre otherwise. Lingering effect of this that has gone on. I'm totally feeling all of this. I don't know. What do you guys think about it? Obviously, we're taking steps already. Katie's created this hashtag. We're connecting with people. Kat has her list. By the way, that's easy to find. You want that list? You just go to @CatRambo. That is her Twitter handle, and you will see lists. And you go to the thing that says lists, and it's there. Recommend that to everybody. I'll probably include that as a link as well. Question?
One of the things that gives me hope that we can preserve a lot of this history is the rise of independent publishing. Because as you said, right, when readers don't care about who the author is, they care about, you know, is this a book that I'm going to read and I'm going to enjoy it, I'm going to be able to find more by it. The fact that it allows a lot of people to go back and publish their backlist. People like Kate Wilhelm, people like Vonda McIntyre, people like Catherine Acero, Pat Cadigan, and, you know, just a ton of folks, right? So one of the things that is important is not to let those voices get lost. There is a wonderful book by Dale Spender called Man-Made Language that talks about a lot of gendered implications of conversation. But Dale Spender also put together a wonderful book called Mothers of the Novel that went back and looked at the earliest days of the novel and showed that actually at the rise of the English novel, there were more women writing than men. And in fact, it was an incredibly popular form. There were women supporting themselves, and they've been sort of erased in a way that Joanna Russ would be super familiar with. It would be lovely to see feminist presses continuing to republish, you know, to find stuff that is sort of lost, that you can only discover in used bookstores in obscure corners, right? It would be lovely to have someone republishing that. That's what I would subscribe to, such a press. Someone please start it. Nancy, are you going to start it?
No, well, I already sort of started it, except it's not precisely a feminist press, and that's Bookview Cafe, which was in fact started by a group of women there was an email, one of those old Yahoo lists of science fiction, women science fiction and fantasy writers. And somebody, I think it was Sarah Zettel, said, you know, I'm thinking about putting some of my backlist out on ebook, because at that time, this was in 2008, at that time, a whole lot of people had contracts where they published the print rights, but they never sold the e-rights, because when they sold the book, the e-rights didn't exist. So we started, somebody said, anyway, Sarah says, oh, I want to publish my backlist. And somebody else says, gee, I'd like to do that too. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, let's put on a show. And we ended up with this group, and we started out trying to figure out what we were doing. It started out publishing ebooks. Now a lot of times we're publishing print versions as well. Vonda McIntyre's entire backlist is on there in ebook. Judith Tarr's got a whole backlist on there, plus Judith Tarr's recent space opera, which is fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. You know, you've been reading Judith on the history of space opera. Go read her space opera. She's a great writer. Linda Nagata's on there writing military science fiction. And eventually some guys came along and joined us, and they were in general the kind of guys who work well with others. I mean, that's the core. Bookview Cafe is a co-op. The core is people who work well with others. And we edit for each other. We do a lot of proofreading for each other. We format books for each other. It's still a complicated process. We're not perfect, but we got a lot of books out there, and a lot of them by people that you've heard of. Ursula Le Guin is one of our members. She's doing that to be kind to us. You know, Ursula does not need an independent publisher. She can do just fine without one, but she's always been, and I think this is an important thing and maybe historically about some of the women's science fiction, Ursula has always been very supportive of things that have come along. And a lot of the other, I mean, Vonda McIntyre also is another good example of somebody who's always supportive of new writers, supportive of other people, and particularly supportive of women's efforts. So it's not like it's anything new. Social media makes it easy for us to find each other, but it's been there. And I guess I would put in a plug while I'm thinking about it for WisCon, which gets more and more complex every year. But WisCon opened at the point when I started going to WisCon, which is kind of 15, 20 years ago now. That's where if you wanted to find all the books that women were writing, that's where you went, because they'd be there, or Room of One's Own Bookstore would have them, the dealer's room would have them, you'd meet the people, and then social media now is another place to find it, but at the time there was not. Conventions putting people out there. WisCon is doing, I think, an exceptionally good job at this point of making sure you find writers of color. They've had any number of people, Andrea Hairston, Nisi Shaw. I'm going to start blanking on names, but those two, just as starters, any number of people as guests of honor. They've become very visible. And well, a bunch of other conventions have said, oh, gee, it's a shame we can't seem to get any Black people to our convention. At WisCon, there's a really major presence now, an African-American presence at WisCon, and other cultures coming. It's getting to be more and more diverse in that way. It's been sticky at points because it's hard for people to deal with those things. But I find, I have to say, an awful lot of the science fiction I've read in recent years has been by African-American writers, particularly by women. Pretty much all of what I read is by women, except for a few exceptional men whose work I happen to like Stan Robinson or Chip Delaney. Chip hasn't written any new science fiction lately, so it's out there, and just the old systems and the new systems. But I'm with Kat. We need more presses. I mean, Aqueduct Press is lovely, but it can't be the only feminist press out there in science fiction. Or the small presses are doing so much more interesting work in general than the major ones. Not always. I mean, there's obvious exceptions, but the small presses, that's what small presses have always done, is open the door for new things. And these days, I think it's doing even more, as well as the independent people.
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go ahead and run away, but it's been so lovely getting to chat with you ladies and get to share some thoughts with you. So thank you so much for the invite, Diane, and hope you have a fabulous rest of your conversation. So I look forward to catching up on it.
Bye, Katie.
Thanks for joining us, Katie. That was awesome.
Bye, Katie.
Thank you. We'll catch you guys later.
Mentioned a lot of great resources there. Ken, before we say goodbye today, please put them in the group chat that we've got running, and then I can put the links in the notes and show notes later on wherever the podcast ends up, because I don't want people to miss these opportunities.
I think this has been a lot of fun, and I hope that we'll keep doing something like this, because purely for selfish reasons, I love to find new stuff to read, and this is one way to do it. I think that continuing to promote each other is incredibly huge. And one of the things that I love about the fantasy and science fiction community at large is that we have a tradition of paying it forward, right? I think almost every writer here, or at least every writer that I've spoken to, and particularly working with Clarion West, where when they were new, when they were upcoming, when they were feeling like, oh my God, what am I doing? And sort of floundering, people helped them. you know, in terms sometimes emotionally, sometimes financially, sometimes, you know, just a kick in the butt. But fantasy and science fiction really does that. And one of the ways that I would urge folks to support some of those writers is Judy Tarr, whose piece that we have mentioned has a Patreon. And if you go and subscribe to her Patreon, you get some insight on Judy's writing. And I want to say she's one of my favorite writers. So I've always been really pleased to reconnect with her. And if you look on Patreon, we should probably do a list that's like all the female writers on Patreon. And I say that purely selfishly because I have one. So in the interest of full disclosure, but
On too.
There we go.
See that? We should definitely share that. I agree completely.
It's true. Well, I mean, one of the things that we're finding is, you know, it's often women who are at the cutting edge of things, and it's simply because we are the ones who are often the innovators who have to make do with a lemon and a piece of salt, or, you know, a piece of cardboard and a crying child, or, you know, just any sort of situation. We're the people who gimmick things often. We are the unacknowledged MacGyvers of the world, sometimes emotionally, sometimes physically, sometimes psychologically. Yeah, that's an awful
point there. No, I really relate to that. Right, we've had a conversation in my early 40s in my career. I did the whole care dilemma thing first. Made sure I had a job that paid for their food. When the last one moved out, I turned their room into this. This is my office. And and that was it, right? Have that story start later, because who end up doing the caregiving when caregiving is required. But it's something that, and I think that it's only fair to take into consideration. Frustrated because there's so much out there. Authors, you know, urging young authors. And I am not a young author. I am a starting author. Out there for middle-aged women, I don't see it. I would like to put it out there that maybe there should be something. If people are going to do grants, you know, middle-aged women could use that money too. So
actually, the Speculative Literature Foundation has one for writers who are sort of older and coming back. And I think, I don't know, do you remember, Nancy? It's like the details are like you have to be over 40 or 45, maybe. You
know, I think it's at least over 40.
Okay,
I'm not sure. I've never played it because it's fairly small. It's like, I think it's like $750 or something for like you had a research project of some kind. But as I'm certainly over 40.
50.
In fact, I'm certainly over that too.
Well, yeah. But go ahead.
I was just in fact going to say I've been, you know, the other end of the caretaking thing that hits women, which is the care of elderly parents. And I've also been through that. And I know a lot of people find themselves just about the time they get the kids out of the house, all of a sudden they've got to take care of mom or dad. And I didn't realize when I was doing that, because I was working a day job and I had my father eventually in a nursing home because he had Alzheimer's. I didn't realize how much it was taking out of me until after he passed. And then I realized, my God, you know, I've been sort of exhausted with this, and it has affected what else I'm doing. I mean, there are things you can't do at the same time. And one of them is serious caretaking.
Well, and that's important because women are by kind of socially conditioned to be the people who do it at the expense of everything else, right? Women are twice as likely to drop away from work in order to take care of an older parent. And I can say with my older parents, you know, both of my brothers, and I love them very much and I still appreciate them, but you know, there's a sort of that sort of graceful step backwards where you're like, you're it, that can sort of be disconcerting. But it seems to be. I just want to kind of stress the gendered nature of stuff, because I think women writers do face a lot of stuff. I don't know. It's like that Ms. Magazine essay, What I Really Want is a Wife, which came out in the 70s. And somebody pointed me at it recently. And is that sort of like, who wouldn't want a wife? You know, she'd do this and this and this. And you're just like, yes. And, you know, I appreciate my spouse. I love my spouse very much. But I know that I have a whole bunch of male colleagues whose wives or girlfriends have devoted their lives to being that person's publicist / editor / secretary. And I'm not aware of any woman except for women in same-sex relationships that have a similar thing. In fact, I can think of one friend whose husband has literally never read one of her several dozen books. And I think, you know, is it gendered? Yeah, hell yeah. Sorry, I'll stop. I'll hop off my soapbox now.
Having my experience of that was very young. It had nothing to do with writing, but when I was in law school and putting myself through school, I mean, my parents were helping where they could, but they were broke at the time too. And watching all these wives put their husbands through law school, and I really started to hate those guys. I really did, because they did not have to worry about everything that I had to worry about. And that comes along. And I've been basically independent my whole life, take care of myself, and I didn't have children, so I haven't had that until I was helping. But basically, it was just me and my sister. I do not have any brothers who were falling down the job. My sister and I were taking care of my father, and thank God for my sister, who came in and made all the hard decisions when we had to make hard decisions, because that was difficult for me. But it is gendered. It's going to be gendered until we stand up for ourselves more and more. And obviously we don't want to be abandoning people that we care about to stand up for ourselves. I think that's part of the problem. You don't want to abandon the person that needs you. But it is gendered, and it is a problem. And I also know women whose husbands never read anything they write. Fortunately, my significant other does read what I write and has a tendency to find the holes in it, which is sometimes very annoying, but also very valuable.
To be fair, my editor, and he's awesome. I don't, but I've been through it all, right? Okay, I'm in a polyamorous relationship. Major car accident about 10 years ago now. While he couldn't do anything for himself, he had severe nerve damage from the ICU. Did a lot of that. Mom is bipolar. She struggled a long time to get proper care. Did. By that time, she'd been hospitalized twice. And I often find myself in a situation where I have to as her advocate, and you know, I don't mind. I feel this, you know, the care dilemma very much. I've had a lot of that in my, and I find it weird, right? Because like you say, it is gendered. Not good at this, right? This is not something that comes naturally to me. I've always been leading the charge. Stuff I really have to work at. Feel that I'm good at, like, I'm good at the proverbial kick in the pants, but I'm not good at the proverbial, you know, hold you while you cry. And maybe it's a good lesson for me, you know, but does tend to naturally fall on us. I don't want to abandon it because the need is there, but it would be nice if more guys did step up some of that responsibility. I think we're going to see it more and more. I think we already are. You're right. I don't really know where I was going with that.
Well, it's something that I think as we see roles shifting you're going to see more and more of it. But it's still, it's very interesting to me. Like I have a friend who is a male writer who's a stay-at-home husband, and he's raising the 2 kids, and he talks about going to the park with his kids and feeling creepy, you know, and feeling like he can't talk to the other parents because they're all mothers, and he's kind of like the guy, you know, and I think that's crappy, right? I mean, I think that whenever you've got these very cookie cutter roles, everybody, you know, men, women, and people who don't identify as either, right? I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me about this decade is we're seeing gender splintering, I think, in a way that 30 years ago, people other than me probably could have predicted, but I grew up in small town Indiana, and I could not have. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, I love seeing all the kind of fierce young folk who are, I think, challenging these roles. And I'm really curious to see what will happen. And so can I plug my anthology that I'm doing, in fact, which is about what's going to happen a generation from now based on today's policies. And I hope there's some hopeful stories in there. But if people are interested, I hope you'll go to Parvus Press, Parbus Press, and look at the guidelines.
Yes, plug your anthology. Plug all your stuff.
Plug all the stuff.
I'm definitely excited about your anthology, and I will go look at the guidelines.
Good.
Yeah, I'm with you. I really love the way that between the. It seems to me I've gotten to know a lot of trans women in the last few years, and that is upending everything. The way and then listening to being at the Tiptree Symposium last year in Eugene, where there were panels with trans women and trans men, and the trans men were talking about being pregnant before they might decide to do some hormonal therapy, and it's like all these things that we think we take for granted are just being upended, and I love it, because that means that I don't have to be stuck with what you know, I can be as obviously female as I am, and I'm perfectly happy with the body I was born with. You know, I have no difficulties with that. I don't want anything else, but that doesn't mean I have to be what everybody else thinks a woman ought to be. And the more who say they're genderqueer or trans or whatever, then if they can be who they want to be, then I get to be who I want to be too. So to me, this is just a broadening that makes it easier for all of us to become the person we're most supposed to be in. I think I just got a text. I'm sorry, with bad timing. I was going to say, and this is slightly different topic, but I'm currently working on a book about a feminist book about self-defense. I finally decided that's what my real take on it is that it is a feminist take, and that it has to do with you know, how we can be out there and be stronger, and in those situations where the people are talking over us and so forth, not just in the situations of potential violence, and that it's not very much that self-defense has so very little to do with physical fighting. So that's something I'm working on. So, what I'm finding is at the same time I'm working on a novel, and I realize that the underlying principles are the same in both books. So, and it's very much, oh yeah, women can do all these things, and don't even pretend that we can't. That's, you know, I'm just really at the point of, I think it's possibly a couple of things I've read in the news lately. It's like, you know, I'm just not going to put up with these guys anymore. And and obviously we're talking not about all men, because there's perfectly wonderful men out there, but I'm not going to put up with the guys who talk over me. I'm not going to put up with the guys who act like jerks. I'm not going to put up with the people who want to ignore me or push me aside. And it's the attitude that I bring to it. And that partly comes from the martial arts, and it partly comes from, I'm just pissed off and I'm just not willing to be pushed over. And one more thing that comes out of that I've also recently become very aware of. When I was young, and starting out, and I went to law school, which was very male at the time, and I've trained in martial arts, and I've even at the time when I was teaching a club at the University of Maryland, I've never trained in a place where there weren't more men than women, even when I was a teacher. And I realized I spent a lot of my life trying to impress men so they let me into the club. And at this point in my life, I really don't care about impressing men that much. I really want to impress women. There's so many women out there who just I admire, who I respect. I want to impress them. I want them to read my books. I want them to want to read my books. So, so I feel like my life is coming to the science fictional end, and the rest of the ends are all coming together in one piece at this point.
Yeah, I totally get that. I think you guys are right. I think that there is a certain conservative faction that is aware that the debates and the controversy that centers around people is the battleground right now that is breaking all the molds. And I don't think they like it, which is why they're so about it. I guess they know perfectly well that this will decide once and for all. That in see now, okay, my perspective, right? I'm a kid of the 80s. I kind of fall between second and third wave feminism, right? And I think second wave feminism had to tolerate a lot of cool kind of things in order to be accepted. Third wave feminism wasn't satisfied with that. They want roles anyway. Why does this nonsense exist? I'm very encouraged by watching my kids age from their mid-20s. And see, now I was once literally kicked out of a pizza joint for kissing my girlfriend. See anything at all. They have doesn't even occur to them. They don't understand why people have issues with people who are gay or people who are trans. They don't. There's the problem, and see, is bright. I think that we're going to see the pushback that we're getting right now is the last gasp of the dinosaur. So I'm check out your anthology too. I would like to see stories like that. Actually, this brings up another topic, and I wanted to address this one to Kat in particular, but Nancy throw in too, right? I've noticed that in recent years, it looks like, I don't know, the bigger awards, the nebulas, obviously I'm talking about in particular since you are the SFWA president, right, are looking more towards women and other marginalized groups. And I think that as a result, this is beginning to reflect the past couple of years, there have been a huge amount of women sweeping through the awards. And I'd like to know your take on that. Is this something that is consciously being done within the organization?
Okay. So the nebulas are, I will say, yeah, lots of women getting, appearing, lots of gay and lesbian and trans representation, lots of racially diverse representation, which I think is just freaking awesome. I would love to be able to claim credit for that, but the fact of the matter is that those are chosen by SIFWA members. Then that we've got, you know, hundreds of people voting. Things that I have done to try to drive voting patterns upward include taking the recommended reading list and making it not just available to members, but publicly facing, so people had a reason to stick their reading up there. I have a project called the First Pages Project, or the First Chapters Project, which is aimed at making award reading for novels easier. But mainly, I think it's just a sign of the times. And it maybe is a sign that SIFWA has, I think, a significant chunk of writers that are newer, that are, I don't want to say younger, because some of them are like others, folks that have come to this after trying 1, 2, 3, 15 different careers. But there is a new energy in the organization, and I think that the awards reflect that.
Well,
Nancy,
I
do you want
find
to
that
throw
really
in on that?
exciting.
You're currently muted. There you go. Unmute.
Yeah,
And
I was losing the spot. I couldn't find the spot again to unmute. I am still learning Google Hangouts. I really wanted to say that Kat has done an awesome job as president of SIFLA, and she's followed along some other people who I think helped set the stage. I mean, John Scalzi and Mary Robinette Cole all also did. There was some work. There was some real shifting going on. I mean, for a while there, I think there were some folks who were just trying to hold on to the organization to keep it from splintering apart because there were some problem areas. And then sort of this wave of new people got involved and got serious and made a shift. I think it feels real different. SIFLA feels real different these days, and I think that's because we've had the right kind of leadership, and that's so important. I really enjoyed watching the Nebula shift because it's probably been about 10 years ago or now. I moderated a panel on the subject at World Fantasy, and I think it was one of the first years where there were a lot of women winners, and people were saying, oh, there was that, oh, well, we've done that now, so that's good. And somebody fortunately had come up with a list as to how that reflected to the past. And, it's going to take quite a few years before we really catch up to have some kind of parity. Nicola Griffiths, to mention another wonderful writer of hard science fiction and so many other things, was doing a study for a while looking at awards and so forth. And the imbalance is still there, and it was interesting. The Hugos this year, it's been interesting. It's I think again possibly the leadership with the Nebulas that Kat and others have done has sort of bled over into the Hugos, and despite the rabid dogs out there, it seems to be fading over. People are looking for a lot more things, and partly because there's just a whole lot. The expansion has also meant there's been an expansion in the kind of fiction that's considered science fiction, the kind of fiction that we look for, and it's not just diverse because of author. It's diverse because we do a lot of different things with the subject matter, and I think that's fascinating. I've noticed an awful lot of literary fiction is the best literary fiction I've seen in years falls over into fantasy or science fiction on its own. We're having that influence on the greater culture, and I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that is a really good thing. I'm very excited to know that this is just the will of the members, that these shifts are starting to take place. That tells me that probably it's marginalized, and that's cool. Like, that's just a really cool thing. I don't know. I think I've run out of the talking points that I originally had laid out. Ladies, have anything in particular you want to add, or do you have you would like to recommend?
I want to recommend the Joanna Russ book again, and I particularly also want to recommend anything by Joanna Russ. I think that her books are just amazing. I also want to point folks towards Christine Rush has a project, website that is celebrating women in science fiction. And of course, Chris is not just a writer, but very significant as an editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And I want to underscore the Bookview Cafe because I do think that is an effort that really sort of shows the way the future can be. I also want to, sorry, this sounds like an Academy Awards acceptance speech or something, but Catherine Acero established the Andre Norton Award for Young Adult Fiction, and I really think that that is a very cool thing and an example of the sort of efforts that help celebrate people. Because Andre Norton, oh my God, how many of us read Andre Norton and got brought into the genre by her wonderful books. So read more, read lots of stuff. Read lots of stuff by women all over the field. Okay.
Let me just second the recommendations for Joanna Russ in both her How to Suppress Women's Writing is so powerful. And I know when I first saw it, I said, oh, probably I saw it in the 90s, and I said, oh, well, you know, that doesn't really apply anymore. It shouldn't really be a problem. It's really amazing and horrible just how much of a problem it still is. And you will have seen all those issues, everything that's in there, but also read her fiction, because her fiction is incredibly powerful. I came into this field reading more women than men. I still read more women than men. I just, you know, I sometimes forget men write science fiction. And I will make a plug for my publisher, for Aqueduct Press, which has been really pushing the boundaries of the genre in the feminist direction, and pushing the boundaries of feminism as well, because the definition of feminism there is very broad. It's not just what editor Timmy DeChamp thinks is feminism, but she's open to all kinds of ideas and expansion. And it's been a really powerful experience for me working with them, especially because Timmy's one of the great editors of all time, as well as being a great writer, which is not always the case. But I would put in a plug for them as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'd like to recommend a couple of resources. There is a fan site called worldswithoutend.com. I'll provide the links. And they have a list called SF Mistress Works. This is a response to the SF Masterworks list. You know, great science fiction and fantasy novels that were written by women in particular. They also have a yearly reading challenge that they do there called Women of Genre Fiction. I do it every year. I highly recommend it. So my list of recommended women to read is ridiculous, but okay, off the top of my head, some of my personal favorites. James Tiptree Jr. is a frickin' genius. Andre Norton, of course, we've mentioned her several times. Yeah, I was one of those who was dragged into the genre by her wonderful books too. Anne McCaffrey, of course. C.J. Cherry. And you know, I bring these up, need to bring these people up. You should know who these people are, right? But recently I worked at a bookstore, and I was, how many times I had to point them out. People didn't know who they were, and I had to tell them. And that's depressing, right? It's part of that forgotten. Ursula Le Guin obviously is a genius. I'm so glad she's involved in the project collective group. That's fantastic of her, and you know, I want to be her when I grow up. So and okay, I'm a big fan of the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois McMaster Bujold, and if you have any issues with the idea that women cannot write science fiction books, and you also read Elizabeth Moon, because she was a United States Marine, and if she doesn't know how to write military fiction, then I don't know. I mean, there's so many good writers out there, so check it out. That's right, note here, CJ Cherry was the SFWA Grand Master 2 years ago. Yes, there's been, I think, 5 women who have been named as SFWA Grand Masters, right?
Yes. And so can I tell a cherry anecdote to close us off? Because I think this is funny.
Yes, please.
One
I
of
would
the
love to hear this.
one of the great pleasures of being SIFA president is that you get to call the person, or let the people know that they are the SIFA grandmaster. And I was trying to reach her, and finally I messaged her on Facebook and was like, Carolyn, I need to call you. And her first reaction was, Dear Kat, I do not have time to volunteer for SIFWA. And I was like, no, it's a good reason. And she said when I called her, and she was perfectly delighted and sort of wonderfully surprised, but she said she had done a database for SIFWA several decades before, and her first thought was that something had gone wrong with the database, and I was calling her in true SIFWA fashion, trying to get her to troubleshoot it. So that's another thing I want to point out, is women volunteering is one of the reasons that a lot of this stuff gets done. So if you're a SIFWA member, come volunteer for me. I'll have good use for you. All right. Okay, now I'm going to shut up, Diane. We should probably close off because we've been going for over an hour.
That's true. Well, thank you both so much for joining me. And I'm sorry we didn't get to talk to Laura Mixon today. I hope she'll join us on a future podcast. Will be once monthly. It will be approximately at the beginning of the month. There will be announcements prior to the date when we can get everybody together, because it will always be in panel format, and authors are very busy people. I have found that it's very difficult to get them to commit to a specific time altogether without a lot of work. So it will be near the beginning of the month. That's the best I can do for the specific date. We will have a different panel every month. It will ideally feature both indie and traditionally published authors in every panel. We'll discuss a lot of different things. We'll discuss different subgenres within speculative fiction. I'm going to have at least one panel, probably more, over the gender conversation. I'm very interested in that, so I hope other people are as well. I would like to feature a panel of, and if they have specific concerns, I know there's a lot of whitewashing that goes on. I heard a horrible story about the cover of Binti before it was published that, it just still goes on, but it does. We're going to talk about fiction. We're going to compare and contrast the differences between independent, small press, and large press publishing, and a whole lot more. So I hope that you'll stick with us. Try to have all those links below. And ladies, you have anything you want to say before we sign off?
Just thanks for having us.
That's it. Thanks a lot. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, it's been a real honor talking to you both. Again, I hope to have you back sometime. See you again.